Good morning, everybody. Welcome to our fire risk assessment webinar. Hopefully everybody can hear me. So today we're literally just focusing on fire risk assessments. I'll just go to the next slide. As you can see, these are the aims of our session today. So we'll talk about what a fire risk assessment is, why you need a fire risk assessment, who can actually carry out a fire risk assessment. If you need to appoint someone to do it for you, how to go about doing that, making sure they're competent, etc. We'll cover that. There's guidance that you can use to help you complete a fire risk assessment if you choose to do it yourself. So we'll have a little look at that. We'll actually go through the different stages of a fire risk assessment, and then we'll just cover sort of further information. For the purpose of this presentation, we'll be basically sort of assuming that people have fairly simple premises. So we're not talking about complex premises, large premises, just simple premises for the purposes of this presentation. So just a quick introduction. My name's Louise Crofts. I'm a fire safety inspector with Bedfordshire Fire and Rescue Service. We are recording the webinar. Obviously nobody has, we've not enabled people to have their cameras or microphones on, so hopefully this is not an issue for anybody. I will switch my camera off after this initial introduction, so I'm sure you don't want to be staring at me for the next 45 minutes to an hour. During the presentation, we will launch some mini polls. Could you please complete these, as your feedback is really important to us, and it also helps to guide future delivery. We also have a Q&A function. So if you have any questions that come to mind during the webinar, please pop your question in the Q&A box, and we will endeavour to answer these during the presentation. If we're not able to, then we can send the answers post presentation. So these are the aims of the session. This is what we're hoping to cover. And we'll get stuck in. So I'll switch my camera off now, and then we'll start getting into fire risk assessments. Okay. So some of you may have some knowledge of fire risk assessment. Some of you may be business owners. You may already have a fire risk assessment. Some of you may, be employees and are attending purely for information or CPD. But basically, as you can see on the slide, fire risk assessment, it's a methodical examination of the risk to the building's occupants from fire. So we're sort of primarily focusing on life safety, not protection of property. So looking at what hazards there might be in a building, how can we control those hazards? How can we reduce them or eliminate them entirely? That's the ideal thing to do, but that's not always possible. What arrangements can we put in place to help protect people from fire? And it's not just about the building itself, it's also about how that building is managed in terms of fire safety, because that you can have great fire protection measures in place, but if you don't have the management to support those measures, then they're really not going to be sort of worth having almost. So let's go on to the next slide. So bear with me. Okay, so people often say, well, why do I need a fire risk assessment? My shop's a tiny shop. I'm not going to have a fire. Why do I need a risk assessment? So it's all driven by legislation. So the main piece of fire safety legislation is the Regulatory Reform Fire Safety Order 2005. So it's been around for quite some time. Article 9 of that piece of legislation states that the responsible person must make a suitable and sufficient assessment of the risks to which relevant persons, so relevant persons are employees, customers, etc. So a suitable and sufficient assessment of the risks to which relevant persons are exposed for the purpose of identifying the general fire precautions he needs to take to comply with the requirements and prohibitions imposed on him by or under this order. Very wordy, very legalese. What does it actually mean? Obviously, we're going to cover that and break it down for you. Talks about the risk assessment being suitable and sufficient. So suitable and sufficient isn't defined in legislation, as is often the case. But the suggestion is that to meet the criteria, the risk assessment should identify the risks arising from or in connection with work that takes place at that premises. The risk assessment should be appropriate to the nature of the work. So obviously every premises is different. Different types of premises, different processes, different types of businesses. So therefore, that attracts different types of risks. And it focuses on, what an employer should do to, what's reasonable, what should they reasonably be expected to know. So it's not talking about people being, fire safety experts, fire engineers or anything like that. It's kind of what's reasonable. What should they have foreseen if they had taken, the correct steps and had followed available guidance. So a second piece of legislation, which is relatively new, is Section 156 of the Building Safety Act 2022. So this has really sort of changed the fire risk assessment approach. Basically, what it said is because of Grenfell, this all stems from Grenfell, of course, and because of Grenfell, now every business has to have a written fire risk assessment, a full written fire risk assessment. Previously, you, under the Regulatory Reform Fire Safety Order, you only needed to have a written fire risk assessment if you had 5 or more employees, if your premises was licensed, or there was an alterations notice in force on the premises. But now, because of Section 156 of the Building Safety Act, every commercial premises needs to have a fire risk assessment, regardless of how many employees, how large, how small. It doesn't matter anymore, and that risk assessment has to be a full risk assessment, whereas previously people were only required to record significant findings. So why do we do this? Why should a business have a fire risk assessment? So obviously you've got the legal side of it, but it's also like the moral side of it as well. So obviously you want to prevent fire. Nobody wants to have a fire. People could be injured or be killed. It can obviously massively affect your business continuity, for example. As an employer, you want to keep your employees safe. You don't want your employees to be hurt. A fire can have a huge impact on the environment. If a fire occurs in a school, that community loss, particularly if that school is the only school in a village, for example, where will those children go? How will they continue their education? So there's lots of reasons why you should have a fire risk assessment, preventing fire from occurring in the first place, keeping people safe, ensuring business continuity, because 80% of businesses that suffer a serious fire actually close within 18 months of that fire occurring. So that's quite an eye-opener. And as I've said, protecting the environment and vital community assets and resources, schools, hospitals, etc. So next we'll focus on who should actually be completing this fire risk assessment. So it's the responsibility of the responsible person. So the person who is responsible for fire safety in a premises. So it might be the employer. Primarily it will be the employer. If there aren't employees, then it may be the leaseholder, or the person that has the tenancy, or it could be the building owner. There's a hierarchy that we would follow. So assuming that you are the responsible person, if your premises is not overly complex, then you can actually do the fire risk assessment yourself with help, sort of using standard fire safety risk assessment guides, which are government issued guides, and they are free to download, free to use. To do this, you should have some knowledge of fire safety, but there are some really useful templates, fire risk assessment templates out there that you can actually follow, and they take you through the process like step by step. And we will cover the templates and the risk assessment process a little bit later in the presentation. So you, the responsible person, yes, you can complete that fire risk assessment yourself. Obviously, the benefit of doing this is it will save you money. If you feel that you've got the competence, you're quite happy to follow a template, refer to the guidance, the relevant government guidance, then yes, providing that your premises isn't overly complex, then yep, go ahead and complete that fire risk assessment. However, if you don't have the time, or you just feel that you haven't got the expertise, you don't have the knowledge, you're just not confident in doing that, then you can appoint someone to do that for you. And it's all about competency. So you need to appoint a competent person. So for example, a professional risk assessor, someone that's got experience in the industry, they have got qualifications in fire safety, and we'll talk about that a little bit more in a slide or two. It's important that I point out that we cannot carry out a fire risk assessment for you. So Bedfordshire Fire and Rescue Service cannot do that for you. I think there's a common misconception that we can, because we go out, we audit premises, we are looking at the type of things that a fire risk assessor would look at, but we can't carry out the fire risk assessment for you because it's a bit of a conflict of interest there. We are an enforcing authority, so if we carry out a fire risk assessment, if it turns out not to be suitable and sufficient, something goes wrong, somebody's injured, well then potentially we would have to enforce against ourselves, and obviously that makes no sense whatsoever. So we can't do that for you, but we can, help and advice, guidance, point you in the right direction, etc., to sort of help you with that. So just touching upon a competent person. So the definition is somebody who has had sufficient training, they've got relevant qualifications, they've got experience, so they must have had specific training in relation to fire risk assessments, fire safety. So you'll be looking at what qualifications have they got, do those qualifications relate to the assessment of risk, fire risk. Have they had experience of assessing your type of building? So there's no point getting somebody in who's their sort of day-to-day is assessing sort of small shops, and you've got a larger complex premises. Are they really the best person to be doing that for you? So like I've said, if you have a larger complex premises, it's very it's definitely advisable to appoint a professional risk assessor. I would advise against doing that yourself unless you have those qualifications, experience, which some people they may well have. And the competency of fire risk assessors is a bit of a sort of hot topic at the moment. Under Section 156 of the Building Safety Act, there is not a clause, but the government at some point in the future will be bringing in a framework for the competency of fire risk assessors. So because of Grenfell, etc. So it will be quite clearly defined what fire risk assessors must have to be able to carry out fire risk assessors. They'll have to be on a register, etc. It will be, quite strict for obvious reasons, because we don't want another Grenfell situation. We need to be sure that people that are carrying out these fire risk assessments on behalf of a responsible person actually know what they're doing, and are up to the task. So if we have a little look at the next slide, it's a bit wordy, but basically, if you decide that you're not confident in carrying out the fire risk assessment yourself, you decide, I want to appoint someone, appoint a competent fire risk assessor. How do I go about that? What kind of things should I be looking at? So we've briefly touched upon that, but this slide sort of breaks it down a bit further. So it's about obviously, checking that they are competent. How can you do that? That there is a criteria that's been set down by the Fire Risk Assessment Competency Council. So have they audited your type of premises before? When you engage with someone, you need to be quite clear about what it is you want them to do. Risk assessors will often go out to they'll go to a premises to carry out a risk assessment, and they find that they can't access certain areas of the building because the person who is accompanying them doesn't have the keys, etc. So it's really important that they have full access to all areas of the building, so they can obviously carry out a suitable and sufficient fire risk assessment. As like anything in life, if you're looking to have some work carried out, always obtain alternative quotes. We generally say to people, obtain 3 quotes. Do your research, have a look. Are there online reviews? Ask the company questions. Ask them to provide sort of evidence and information to you. Any decent fire risk assessment company will have that information available. They will be able to provide it to you, and will be more than happy to do that. So here it talks about references from previous clients who run or own similar premises types. Speak to them. Were they satisfied? Were there any issues? Do they feel that the fire risk assessment company did a good job and it was suitable and sufficient? So yeah, obviously lots of quite wordy, lots of bullet points there, and it will depend on your premises as to kind of how much information you want to obtain, but obviously do your due diligence, do your research, make sure that the company you're approaching is reputable. They have been around for a while. Their fire risk assessors have got the knowledge, experience, qualifications, and they can evidence that, because ultimately the responsibility for a fire risk assessment being suitable and sufficient lies with the responsible person. So you must do your due diligence. Okay. Now I briefly talked about Fire Risk Assessment Competency Council. So there is some guidance that's been produced by the Fire Sector Federation, which can help you find a competent fire risk assessor. I've put the link on the screen there, but this presentation will be available on our website post presentation, so it will be there, so you can refer to that. But that is the link to that guidance. If you need to find a competent fire risk assessor, you can use that, and also make sure you cover the steps that I've talked about previously in doing your due diligence, your research, obtaining 3 quotes, etc. So I briefly touched upon the responsibility ultimately lies with the responsible person for making sure that fire risk assessment is suitable and sufficient. So under fire safety law, you're not expected to be an expert in assessing and controlling fire safety risks. But sort of even when employing a contractor to help you with an assessment, you have to make those reasonable checks, like you would for anything. You're not just going to go to the first person, just not ask any questions and just appoint them, and not really knowing if they're up to the job. Anecdotally, I think it's important that I say I've come across been out to sort of various different premises, and I've seen many fire risk assessments, and often they've been carried out by ex-firefighters. I think it's important that I say that ex-firefighters don't always make the best fire risk assessors. Often people think, oh, they worked for the fire service for 30 years. They must know what they're doing. I mean, yes, obviously operationally they know all about fighting fires, but the thing is, if they haven't sort of undertaken those fire safety qualifications, they're not necessarily going to be, the best person to carry out a fire risk assessment. So yeah, just bear that in mind, because I have seen that on quite a few occasions. Risk assessment has been carried out by an ex-firefighter from whichever fire and rescue service, not necessarily Bedfordshire. And upon reviewing the fire risk assessment, it's quite clear that they don't really have a full understanding of how that process should be carried out, and people kind of blindly trust that they're an ex-firefighter, they know what they're doing, it's going to be absolutely fine. But ultimately, if anything goes wrong at that premises, if anyone's injured or if anyone's killed, the first thing that's going to happen is, where's your fire risk assessment? Let's have a look at it. Was it suitable and sufficient? No, it wasn't. The responsibility lies with the responsible person for that premises. So yeah, just something to bear in mind. Okay, so talked about if you were going to do a fire risk assessment yourself, there are government guides that are available free of charge to you. This slide just gives a little snapshot of, I mean, there's quite a few guides. These aren't all of them, but you've got, for example, offices and shops, factories and warehouses, educational premises, small and medium places of assembly, sleeping accommodation. There are other guides as well. So the idea is you pick the guide that's relevant to your premises. If you're not entirely sure, for example, small and medium places of assembly, well, what exactly does that mean? If you're not really sure which guide applies to your premises, if you open up the guide, and they all tend to follow the same format, open up the guide and there's an introduction section at the beginning of the guide, and it will, within that introduction section, it will state which premises the guide applies to. So have a little read of that. If you're still in doubt, you can always contact us, and we can obviously advise on that. So these guides are really sort of straightforward, nicely laid out, quite easy to use. So the guides consist of two parts. So part one talks about the 5 steps to follow to carry out that fire risk assessment. And then part two kind of drills down a bit further, provides further guidance based on your type of premises, and it talks, gives information about fire precautions. So these are the things that measures that are undertaken to sort of minimise the risk of damage from fire to life and then property. So fire, you might think, well, what are fire precautions? What are you talking about? Fire precautions, things like fire detection and warning systems, fire extinguishers, escape routes, emergency lighting, signs and notices, training. So all the things that you need to consider and the things that you may need to have in place to ensure that your premises is safe and also compliant with legislation. So yeah, these guides are really good, and you can see on the slide I've put a link to the .gov website, and where you'll be able to find these, the guides that you can see on the slide, but also other guides as well, because there are quite a few, and completely free of charge. So yeah, if you want to do the fire risk assessment yourself, or you feel that you're confident and you feel that you can do it, then use the relevant guide to help you with that process. So you've got the guides, the government guides, but also you need to use a template. You don't have to, but why wouldn't you? It makes sense. It kind of sets it out. It makes it a lot easier for you. So the government issued they updated their fire risk assessment template in 2022. And so this is for simple premises, so not sort of large, complex premises. And this is freely available, and it sort of covers the 5 steps to risk assessment. So the link is there, so you can, you're more than welcome to download that, print it, and use that to carry out your fire risk assessment with the with the relevant guide for your premises. We also have a slightly different template hosted on our website, which is also free to download. So it's really, whatever works best for you. Ours is slightly longer, but it's still not onerous. So you're free to obviously download those, have a look, see what works best for you, see what you're comfortable with, and go from there. But yeah, it really, it's a really, I mean, the government template is it's really well laid out, and it prompts you. It gets you thinking about things that perhaps you wouldn't consider. It's almost like a fresh pair of eyes, because I've been on audits where people say, well, why do I need a fire risk assessment? I'm not going to have a fire here. It's for example, I had a query from someone who was a responsible person for a church, and they said, well, it's just stone, it's a stone building, like unless we get hit by lightning, what's going to catch on fire? And I said, well, do you have electrical equipment? Yeah. Well, electrical equipment can obviously catch on fire, and she hadn't thought about that. So, using that template prompts you as you work your way through it to consider the things that perhaps you just would never think about, not, working in fire safety. Okay, so I'm going to take you through the 5 steps of a fire risk assessment. So hopefully you'll find this useful. And like I say, use the guides, use the templates. You can't go far wrong with that. So step 1, the first thing you need to do is identify the fire hazards. So what could potentially start a fire? So we're talking about ignition sources and combustible materials. So I've given a few examples there of what constitutes an ignition source. So you can see there we've got electrical equipment, which is a common cause of fires. Smoking, I think slightly better controlled now than obviously what it was previously, but things can still go wrong in relation to smoking. People discarding cigarette butts carelessly, not having designated smoking areas, people smoking too close to buildings, rubbish, etc. So heating appliances, people bring in their own portable heating appliances. Cooking, depending on the type of premises. Arson, where do you keep your bins? Are they secure? Also, when people get contractors in doing hot works, there should be some quite robust procedures for those contractors to follow. And even after they've completed, their work, there should be a process where they have to sort of check after half an hour and so on and so forth, just to make sure that a fire doesn't not reignite, but a fire doesn't ignite as a result of the work they've been doing. And then we've got combustible items, so obvious things like paper, wood, cooking oil, plastic, gas, some cleaning substances are sort of highly flammable. So it's about trying to control those things and keep ignition sources away from combustible items. So it's thinking about, have you found anything that could start a fire? Is there anything that could actually burn, if it was to meet with a spark? It's thinking about all of those things, which, follow the template. It will prompt you. These are things that perhaps you just haven't maybe thought about. And the little image there shows overloading of plug sockets and misuse of extension leads. So I've seen that, quite a few times when I've been out on audits. And people think, well, because you've got, 4, on an extension lead, you can plug 4 items in, it must be safe, and I can't quite reach the plug, I'll plug it into another extension lead, and that's when, issues start to occur. So it's just having that awareness and making sure that, you try and do things as safely as possible. So once you've identified your fire hazards, what do you do then? So the next stage is to think about the people. So obviously it's about life safety. That's why we're carrying out these fire risk assessments. It's to keep people safe, prevent them from being injured or harmed. So who are these people? Who do we need to keep safe? So the phrase that we use is the relevant person. And depending on the type of premises, it will be sort of employees, lone workers. So, employees that perhaps work alone, or contractors that are coming in to carry out work. Customers. So if you have a shop, you've got customers. Visitors. So people that aren't familiar with the premises, visiting for a specific purpose. I've mentioned contractors. Something that people don't always think about, under fire safety legislation, you also need to consider people in the immediate vicinity. So that people walking past your premises, the people in the building next door. People don't always consider that. They might just focus on, what's happening inside the building, which is the bulk of it. But you also need to kind of think, outside of the box, if you will. And also we need to really give strong consideration to those especially at risk. So this could be young people, old people, people who are sleeping, depending on the type of premises, people with disabilities that might need assistance in the event of a fire. So really important that, because these people perhaps won't be able to either understand or have the capacity to kind of know what to do. They might not be able to self-evacuate. So it's thinking about, well, do we need any specialist evacuation equipment? Do we need a PEEP, which is a personal emergency evacuation plan for those people that are disabled? So, you need to think about, who are the people, and, that could be at risk from a fire within your premises. And, that could be anyone really. Also people, if you have shift work, people working at night, do they know what the fire alarm sounds like? Have they heard it? Because obviously testing normally happens during the day. So you need to, consider all of these things. So we'll go on to, so you've thought about what hazards do you have? Who's at risk? So what do you do then? You need to do something with this information. So then you need to, using the guidance, because all of the information is in the guidance and it's broken down, by category, so it's quite easy for you to follow. So you need to think about emergency routes and exits. So if there is a fire in the premises, will people be able to get out? Are there sufficient, are there enough exits for the number of people that are in that premises? Are the emergency routes protected? Are they clear? Do they lead to a place of safety? How are you going to warn people of a fire? It really depends on the type of premises as to what is required. There's manual systems, which could just, in a small shop, for example, could just be a simple shout of fire, because if a fire starts, you will see it, and then everybody leaves the premises. So it just depends on the type of premises. Firefighting equipment, so this is your fire extinguishers, fire blankets. It depends on the type of premises. It depends on the risks that are there, but the guidance talks you through that. Talks about the amount that you might need, the types of firefighting equipment that you might need. If your premises uses dangerous substances because of the type of business, is there a way to maybe use an alternative substance that is safer? Thinking about, where do you keep those substances, the amount that you have, do you need to keep the amount that you have? Could you reduce the amount? So it's all, thinking about how can we sort of reduce that risk. Having an emergency evacuation plan. If you don't have a plan, how will people know what to do? So you need to, vulnerable people. So we've talked about this. So thinking about the elderly, young children, those with disabilities. You might have staff with a hearing impairment. Would they, if they were working on their own, would they know if the fire alarm went off? You also need anyone coming into your premises, so contractors and visitors. Often they may well be, well, visitors tend to be accompanied, depending on the type of premises, but contractors might not. They might be there for a specific reason to work, or to repair something or to work on something. They might well be left on their own. Do they know what to do in the event of a fire? Have they been told? And this kind of links into staff fire safety training. It's a legal requirement that staff are trained in fire safety. What that training looks like depends on the size of the premises, the undertaking at the premises, but they have to have fire safety training. They would have that upon induction, and then that training would be sort of repeated, usually on an annual basis. So once you've identified your hazards and risks, so you're evaluating what can you do to remove the hazard or reduce the risk of the hazard. Are your existing fire safety provisions suitable and sufficient, or do you need to upgrade them because you've carried out your risk assessment and you've followed the guidance and you realise that actually what you've got in place isn't quite enough? We touched upon escape routes. Are there enough for the number of people in the premises? Have you actually planned them? Have you planned them out? Do you know where your escape routes go? Have you actually thought about it? Thinking about emergency lighting, if your business runs throughout the day and night, if the power fails because of a fire, have you got emergency lighting? Are people actually going to be able to see to find their way out? Signage, that's really important, particularly if people aren't familiar with the premises. The green arrows, the green running man signs. People need to know where their nearest exit is. It's often not about using the exit or entrance that they are familiar with, because that might not be the nearest one at the time of a fire occurring. So the signage is really important. Fire extinguishers, are they needed? Where should they be located? Have people, staff, etc., been trained in the use of them? If the fire risk assessment deems that's appropriate. We talked about keeping sources of ignition away from fuel sources, your combustible items. Having a plan, and simple things like who's going to call the fire and rescue service. If you have a fire alarm system, if it goes through to an alarm receiving centre, happy days. If they don't get a response from you, they will call the fire and rescue service, but you might not have that in place. It might not be necessary for your type of premises, because if you don't have a plan, if you haven't made a decision about who will actually carry out that task of calling the fire and rescue service, well, somebody might assume that somebody else is doing it, and then your buildings, everybody may have got out, but your building's burning down, and nobody's actually called the fire and rescue service. So things, there's a lot to think about. And firefighting equipment, your extinguishers, potentially, if a fire starts, there's quite a small fire in a waste paper bin, for example. That's that's what we normally use as an example. If someone has had that training and feels competent, they could potentially put that fire out and stop it from spreading. So obviously, if they don't, we'd always say to people, if they're not confident, if the fire is too big, then you obviously leave the room, shut the door, get out, raise the alarm, get everybody out, and call the fire and rescue service. But yeah, these are the type of things that you need to sort of consider when you're evaluating your findings from step 1 and step 2. So we'll move on to step 4. So previously I've said your fire risk assessment must now be recorded in full. So everything needs to be there, all of the steps that you've followed and your findings, not just significant findings now. If you use a template, it talks you through it, you fill it in as you go, and by doing that, you've effectively recorded your fire risk assessment in full. So it's just having that plan, having thought about it, consulted with employees, relevant persons, and thinking about how are we going to achieve this. What do we need to do? Often when you carry out a fire risk assessment, there will be actions, because I don't think, hand on heart, anyone can honestly say that there's nothing that needs improving. It might be really, really minor things, like you might identify that there's some sort of slight damage to a fire door, so therefore that that becomes an action. It needs rectifying, and depending on what those actions are, they will have timescales assigned to them. So if something's is quite high risk, if it's not rectified quickly, could have serious impact on the safety of the people in the building, then obviously that will have quite a tight timescale. It might be with it 1 week or 1 to 2 weeks. It just depends on what those actions are, as to what the timescales will be. But I'd be very surprised if after carrying out a fire risk assessment there were no actions to be carried out, because there's always room for improvement. And a building over time, wear and tear, you might have a proactive inspection plan where you're checking your fire precautions on a regular basis, but things can wear out, they can be damaged. Hopefully you hopefully have a system in place whereby people can report any issues they come across. But yeah, things do wear out and break. So I think I've touched upon it previously, having that emergency plan, evacuation plan, knowing exactly what needs to be done. Also think about business continuity, something that often people don't consider. And particularly if your business, like for a care home, you have to have a business continuity plan. It makes sense. What happens if there's a fire and you have to evacuate the care home? Where are those going to go? Obviously it could be the middle of winter, it could be freezing cold. So having, you might have an agreement with another care home or the local community centre whereby you can move the residents to that place where it will be safe and warm whilst you deal with the issue in hand. So important to think about. So any fire safety provisions that you have, so your fire alarm system, your emergency lighting, your fire extinguishers, are they being maintained? Depending on what you have, for example, if you have a commercial fire alarm system, the requirement under legislation is that you'll have that serviced by a competent person every 6 months. Emergency lighting will be serviced annually, as will fire extinguishers. But then with your emergency lighting, you need to be doing your testing, your monthly flick test. Your fire alarm, you'll be doing your weekly test. So it's making sure that things are tested and maintained, and that you're keeping a record of that. When you produce a fire risk assessment, the risks that are identified, you need to inform your staff of those risks. If those risks can have an impact on them, they need to be aware of that. Training, touched upon training previously. Training will depend on the type of premises that you have. There is guidance on our website which covers the type of training you should follow, the type of training you should consider. Some staff will need additional training, so it might be necessary to have fire wardens at your premises, so they will need that additional training to ensure that they know what they're doing in the event of a fire, because they have that sort of additional responsibility. People will look to them to lead in that sort of emergency situation. So yeah, it really depends on your premises. So obviously where we can eliminate hazards altogether, that's obviously the best way to go, but that's not always going to be possible. So it's about controlling those hazards. So yeah, your fire, going through that process, that fire risk assessment process, will help you to identify those hazards, and then obviously work out how you need to control them. So I'll just go on to the next slide. So the final step of a fire risk assessment is about review. So too many people either produce a fire risk assessment themselves, or they will appoint a competent person to carry that fire risk assessment out on their behalf. Great, lovely. They have this wonderful document, it looks very professional, and then they do nothing with it. So that document might have actions that need to be completed to improve the safety at the premises. They don't complete the actions, or they do, but they don't record on the fire risk assessment that they've actually done that with a date and a signature, for example. Fire risk assessment is a live document, so it's your risk assessment, you can make notes on it, you can write on it, but you need to make sure it's up to date, and obviously any actions you need to complete those within the given timescales. If there's something that you perhaps don't agree with, then you can always contact us for some guidance, advice. But yeah, generally you would look at those actions and complete them within those timescales. So it's important, even if you've completed your actions, you've got your risk assessment, it's up to date, you've annotated it, but you still need to do an annual review. It might be that nothing's changed in the premises. However, it's easy to miss things. Do that annual review, go through that risk assessment, make sure it's still valid. If it is, great, fantastic. Just annotate, make sure that you document that you've done that review. However, if something changes before your annual review date, you will need to review it sooner. So, any kind of significant change, and I will touch upon that in just a moment. If you have a fire, then of course you need to review your fire risk assessment, because there's a reason why the fire started. So you've got to review your fire risk assessment to make sure it's still valid and suitable and sufficient. Even a near miss, or your stock levels have changed, because say if you're a warehouse, for example, and you increase the level of stock, then that's increasing the fire loading. So you need to review your fire risk assessment. Or if you started to, you've changed what you do, you've started to store more chemicals or dangerous substances, well, you need to review your fire risk assessment. Are the control measures that are currently in place suitable for the increase of those substances or chemicals? So really important, treat it as a live document. Always make a note, document when you've done a review, when you've completed actions. I've been to so many audits where I get given a fire risk assessment, I look at it, and it's it may have been done 2 years ago, and it's as if it's just been done that day. There's nothing on there, nothing to indicate that any of those actions have been followed, or it's even been reviewed. It's your document, make a note on there, write on it. So talked about significant changes, obviously near misses, you have a fire, stock levels, but it could also be a significant change could be you extend your building. There's a structural change. You change the type of business that you're operating. There's a change, so for example, a change of use, or a change in the type of people, the number of people. You might have a business where people are like a residential care home, and people are ambulant, and then over time they become less ambulant and become bedbound. Your fire risk assessment will need to change will need to be reviewed, will need to be updated because of those changes. So that's the fifth and final step. So let's go to the next slide. So I've referred to our website, lots of information on there. There is the web link to our website. So it takes you straight into this sort of fire safety area of the website. You can find some fire risk assessment templates on there, a link to the government fire risk. I think all of them are actually hosted on our website. You'll find them on there. There's a logbook, so you do your fire risk assessment, you get all of your necessary precautions in place, but then you need when you're testing and maintaining these things, you need to record that you're doing that, and there's a fire safety logbook on our website that you can download free of charge. It's quite a large document. Some of it might not apply to you, that's fine. Print it off or have it electronically. Use what is relevant to you. And we also have some information on emergency plans, business continuity. So like I've mentioned before, a lot of businesses, after a significant fire within 18 months, they cease to trade. They no longer exist. There's also some guidance on there regarding fire safety training. I've been out to audits where people say, yep, we do fire safety training, and I ask them, well, what does that include? And say, oh, I've shown people where their fire exits are. and that's not really enough. Depending on the type of premises, it's about prevention. Obviously, you want to prevent a fire from happening in the first place. You'll need to know what to do if one does occur, but actually, if you can prevent it from happening in the first place, that's surely so much better. And our guidance on fire safety training sort of covers, for sort of simple premises, the type of things that you need to consider, the type of things that you would want to cover in fire safety training. And you might do that yourself, or you might decide that you want to get somebody in to do that for you, like a competent person, a reputable company. A lot of companies now do their fire safety training online. They use an online training package, and that's absolutely fine. So I think we're now at the end of our presentation. So hopefully it's been helpful. It's given you a bit of an overview of the fire risk assessment process. There's lots of different ways of approaching it. I've touched upon 2 templates. I really do like the government template. It's so easy to follow. It's been issued by the government, so you can't really go far wrong. And it's great for simple premises. There are many other types, many other templates out there, some which, are more suited to complex premises, but that's when you'll be appointing someone to come in and do that for you. So I wouldn't worry too much about the other types of templates. But yeah, so lots of resources on our website. So please do have a look. If you have any queries at all, if you're not sure about anything, you can contact us. Our email address is on the slide just there, and also we can be contacted via telephone. What I would say is, depending on where your business is based, if you're kind of middle to south of the county, then use the 01582 number, which is our Luton office. And obviously if you're middle to north of the county, use the 01234 number, which is our Bedford office. Once again, we can't carry out those fire risk assessments for you. We can, if you're not sure about something, we'll be more than happy to provide you with advice and guidance and kind of steer you in the right direction. But yeah, ultimately we can't carry those fire risk assessments out for you. So I'm at the end of the presentation now. What I'm going to do is we'll keep the meeting open just for a short period of time in case there are any questions that people want to submit. Myself and my colleague can obviously have a look at those and answer those, and everybody will be able to see that in the Q&A function. And yeah, so hopefully you found it useful. My colleague's been launching some polls, so please do complete those. They're really sort of quick and easy. Takes a second to provide your answer, but it's really helpful to us, and we can obviously sort of steer, basically have a look at what you guys want us to cover in the future, and obviously use your feedback to form the basis of future presentations. So once again, thank you so much for attending. We will host this on our website hopefully within the next few days. So if there were any colleagues that wanted to attend but couldn't, please let them know, and if you have any queries, do get in touch. And we'll stay online for about another 10 minutes if you have any questions. Okay, thanks so much. Thank you.